he has been fed this diet of pretty aggressively misogynist views of history, in particular by George Buchanan and his mother most of all. In terms of James's love for him, no question. In terms of Buckingham's for James, it is very difficult in that era to love a man and a king, and for one not to influence the other. They refer to it as the prostituted title because he's knighted so many people. When it comes to knights, he doesn't really think it matters. He is so stung by public speculation about his private life, and in particular a romance that he ends in order to marry Anna, that he's a bit much. He's sort of, I think it's the equivalent of someone who's maybe not going to be a very good boyfriend, is often the one that writes you songs.
Hello everyone, welcome to the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell, and to our latest historian interview. If you've been here before, welcome back. And if this is the first time you have been checking out my channel, then welcome. If you love British history, you're in the right place, because not only do I have a great historian interview for you today, but there is also over 40 on the channel which you can go back and check out. I also have virtual tours and history documentaries, and quite a lot of those in the pipeline as well to come over the next 12 months. You can also join me live every other week, every fortnight, on a Monday evening for British History Live, if you would like. I'd love to see you there. But today I am joined by historian, author and correspondent Gareth Russell to discuss his latest book, released in the UK on the 27th of February 2025, Queen James, The Life and Loves of Britain's First King, of which I was very fortunate to get an advanced copy. Gareth is a historian and broadcaster and the author of several history books, including Young and Damned and Fair, which was a biography of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, The Ship of Dreams, which is about the Titanic and was a Daily Telegraph Best History Book 2019, Do Let's Have Another Drink, which was all about the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. That was a Times Book of the Year 2022. His book in 2023 won BBC History Magazine Best Book of the Year. That was The Palace, From the Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of History at Hampton Court. And he is the host of his own podcast, Single Malt History, well worth a check out. And he appears frequently on television and radio in his capacity as a historian, author, and royal commentator. Gareth is historian in residence for British History Tours, which is my company, that's what I run, and he will be on the Anne Boleyn Tour in May 2026 and the Royal Scotland Tour, which is going to be in the autumn of 2026. Tickets for both of those tours will go on sale this spring. During those talks, Gareth gives a number of talks. I'm excited to tell you that even if you can't make a tour, there is a way for you to see those talks as well, from Gareth, but also from the other historians who join us, such as the lovely Tracy Borman. If you are a member of my Patreon, you can access the talks. There's already 7 in there, and there's more to come in the Tour Talks collection tab. You just need to go to patreon.com/British History and sign up. It's a low monthly cost, and there's no tie-ins. You can cancel any time. And also, as a member of my British History Patreon, you can submit your own questions for my guests, which is exactly what patrons have done for Gareth today. And I will be putting those questions to him at the end of the main interview. The answers to that section, well, the questions and the answers, of course, make up the extended exclusive version or edit of this interview, which is for patrons only. So it's well worth it if you love your British history. Right. Anyway, what you came for today, Gareth's interview. So, Gareth, welcome back to the British History Channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, so I've given everyone a brief introduction, and actually, I think this is like your 4th or 5th interview with me. But either way, please, for anyone who doesn't know who you are, give a brief introduction, please.
Yes, yeah, of course. My name is Gareth Russell. I'm a historian and biographer, and my latest book is Queen James, which is its title in Britain, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand, and it's out in February, and it'll be coming out as The Six Loves of James I in America and Canada in December.
Wonderful. And I have been getting through my advanced reader copy. Thank you so much for organising that. I mean, I knew it was going to be good, but it's very good. So, this is your first sojourn into the Stuarts era. What made you want to write this book?
I suppose it sprung from my previous book, The Palace, about Hampton Court, and there were three chapters in it about incidents that happened at Hampton Court during James's tenure
Mm,
as king, and it was so rich. And you do a lot of research around it that won't make it into the book. But whilst researching him for the Palace, I thought, God, there's so much here, and it's so fascinating. And when you're wrapping up a book, I started to think with my agent about what the next one should be. And when I mentioned this to my editor, she jumped at it, and I said, "Look, I can't really get this idea out of my head.
mm,
I think there's an immensely rich biography and something that's genuinely new in its focus." And so that was how it was born. It was sort of not being able to let it go and greed for a good story.
mm. I mean, yeah, the chapters in the palace around James's time there were really gripping and interesting. So, but you take us from, well, it was fascinating to get the Scottish element of James's life. Obviously, sort of with being in England, the focus is generally more on once he becomes King of England as well as Scotland, and maybe his role in the in the incarceration and of his mother, and how come he doesn't, that he tends to be in those camps when we're talking about him. So it was great insight into his time in Scotland. I was particularly interested and in parts horrified, I have to say, to hear about his education, especially so under the tutelage of George Buchanan, was it? And
Yeah.
you say James emerged from his education with the mind of a scholar, but not the behaviour of a king. So, first of all, what was his education like? And then what did you mean by that comment?
Yeah, great question. Well, yeah, first of all, I'm delighted that you loved the Scottish bit,
Mm,
and James spent over half his life there. So just over half the book is about his time in Scotland, and it mattered. It really, this idea that Scotland's a prologue is ridiculous. It
mm,
is such a rich, fascinating, extraordinary history, equal to anything that the Tudors produced. I loved writing that, and I hope people enjoy it when they read it. With with his education, so his mother was deposed when he was still in the cradle, really, and he is proclaimed James the Sixth. There has been a history of sort of accidental child monarchs in Scottish history before. So actually the system is quite well placed for the aristocracy to start to pick who will be the regent, and there's tension there. But the government is conducted by a series of increasingly unlucky regents. But with James, he's sent to Stirling Castle, which was probably the most extraordinary, wonderful place I visited in the research for this. It took my breath away. But
mm,
he has a childhood that's usually described almost as Dickensian, although it's obviously anachronistic. But it was miserable from start to finish. It wasn't. It was luxurious. He had a doting governess, the Lady Mar, and he had brilliant physical education. He played golf, football. He loved hunting. He had a group of young friends. So there were very happy parts of the childhood. But where I would disagree with some historians, or just some people who pointed out that the happiness cancels out the unhappiness, is that today, if we heard of a child who was treated by one individual in his life in the way James was treated by George Buchanan, we would still say it was abuse. And actually, there are discussions within Stirling that George's treatment of James is excessive. Lady Mar is sort of constantly fighting with George Buchanan, who is James's tutor and a very odd choice of tutor for a young king, given that he's not particularly keen on monarchy and
mm,
particularly is not keen on the Stuarts. And George Buchanan is an extraordinary intellectual, a gifted historian, and a brutal man. Not always to, I mean, other tutors, other children, the wonderful memories of treat James is really vindictive, and he allows his ideology to cancel out his humanity. Buchanan rises in favour in the Scotland that's created after the downfall of Mary, Queen of Scots. He is, as I say, intelligent, he's Presbyterian, He is someone who knows how to suck up to the right people and to abandon the wrong people when they fall from favor. But the reason why I said in the book that James emerged from the mind with the mind of a scholar is that George Buchanan and his deputy Peter Young do an incredible job with James's intellectual development. This is a child who's fluent in multiple languages, who impresses everyone with his intelligence. He's up studying, at the age of 10, he's up before breakfast studying and loving to study the New Testament in ancient Greek. He does enjoy intellectual pursuits. But because of his politics, George Buchanan refuses to teach him etiquette. And there's none of the polished manners that, say, his mother had had, or even his father, who, didn't really have any other virtue going for him, but he knew how to hold a fork correctly, or a knife, I suppose. But James doesn't have that. And when later figures in his life, particularly French relatives and French visitors, see him, Esme, Duke of Lennox, his father's cousin, is horrified. I mean, cannot believe that a young man who was already a king has not been taught the niceties of decorum. And you remember the world of monarchy communicates through manners. That's how they talk to one another. And James does struggle with it. And he is someone who is always much more relaxed, his supporters would say, undignified, his critics would say, and that is a recurring criticism of his education.
Mm. It, I mean, part of it, he actually, well, openly is trying to turn James against his own mother,
Yeah.
which I found incredible.
Yeah.
And
Well, he is a misogynist, and the reason I will try to only use words like that if the person's views are exceptional enough, that person's prejudice, excuse me, are exceptional enough that they're commented upon at the time. Otherwise, you are just projecting
mm,
past views back. Everyone comments that James's views on women early on, not later, but early on, he has been fed this diet of pretty aggressively misogynist views of history, in particular by George Buchanan and his mother most of all. You have horrible stories of Buchanan, teaching James to regard his mother as a murderess, as an adulteress, as a harlot. And when you read what Buchanan, sorry, is working on a history of the Scottish monarchy at the time he's teaching James, and when you read what goes into the book, you think, my goodness, what went into the classroom? When he says that she was an example of cruelty that had never been matched, and that she had really been sort of a pimp for Darnley, and that she'd forced her ladies in waiting to satisfy his sexual urges because she couldn't be bothered. I mean, it's a dark cauldron of pornography and paranoia that, interestingly, when James is 11, he encounters somebody else who'd known his mother, and he is visibly happy, according to his servants, that Buchanan's version of Mary has been proved wrong by this other visitor.
mm. It must have been well, clearly he inflicted trauma on him in sorts of ways, but that's a particularly cruel
It is,
thing to
and
do.
it explains, I think, there are periods I talk in the book. I think people are very interested in his relationship with his mother, and I talk about it. And actually, in many ways, there was a happier dynamic at one point between them in letters, at least, when she was still imprisoned in England. But the problem was that Mary could not slip up, and there were times that she made mistakes or seemed less than honest. And so, because James still, I think, at the back of his mind, had what Buchanan had said about her, Mary couldn't ever. What he might have forgiven somebody else for, he would immediately think the worst of Mary and think, oh, maybe she is a liar. So there's
Mm.
that Mary is, as I say, Mary makes errors, and there are reasons for James to be suspicious of particularly a few things that she does at one point in about 1583, 84. However, I think she was sort of unfairly hamstrung, if you like, by what had been fed to him when he was younger.
Mm. So, I mean, the book tells us all about James's relationships, which is it is absolutely fascinating. Now, when did James first find himself attracted to men?
Yeah, great question. So I suppose there are rumblings, there are indicators that he's sort of slightly in awe, if you like, of older men. He sort of hero worships them a bit. And looking back on it, some people thought that that was the beginning of him being physically attracted. But that would be sort of like you're talking like 11, 12, 13. So sort of like that period where, I mean, I remember you had a crush on a teacher or something like that. But I actually don't. I wonder, is that hindsight writing it? And
Mm.
in many ways, actually, the people that had sort of been suggested that he sort of had these like adolescent crushes on. I don't think that is true. I think actually in some cases he was looking to them to. They were often distantly related to him, or not so distantly, and I think he was hoping that they would help him politically. But again, you don't know when someone starts to develop feelings. The first, so for me, I started when you start to see actual sort of clear indicators of it. And it's when he's about 17 or 18 and he becomes visibly sort of starstruck by an improbably good-looking Scottish courtier called Patrick Gray. And quite interestingly, in a mirror to James's last favorite, the Duke of Buckingham, the first thing everyone says about Patrick is how good-looking he is.
Mm.
And again, in a slightly less happy mirroring, they also then say he's awful as a person, but he looks great. And Patrick is really the first. Patrick's the first one. So about 1583, 84 is when is when I think you see it. I'm sure, like many people, many teenagers, he probably knew himself before that or suspected beforehand. But from a historian's perspective, it's 1718.
And do we know what James thought about himself, thought about his own sexuality?
Yes, not as much as we would like, in
Mm.
that there's a huge mental gulf between us and him, which is that we want to have thoughts on sexuality and we want it to be identity based. And that's something I don't think he could possibly have understood, much less have processed. There are interesting comments in a book he writes later in his life where he refers to sodomy as an unforgivable sin, although quite interestingly, in the same sentence, he also says that counterfeit coining is equally bad. The problem with sodomy is that it's an imprecise term. It later in Christianity in particular becomes associated with full homosexual sex. But in James's lifetime, it means a lot of different things. So it generally means rampant sexual perversion. It's just not, excuse me, not clear what he meant in that sentence. So some moral philosophers that James read thought that sodomy applied to sexual assault.
Mhm.
That it Others thought that it applied to any form of anal intercourse, including between opposite sex partners. Some thought it was just sort of blanket depravity, and some thought it was specifically between two men. So, unfortunately, because of that umbrella, we just don't quite know what he meant. We do know that he's very comfortable with adopting the language of marriage and heterosexual romances, which would be the only frame of reference he would have, with his male favorites. So you have him in private letters referring to George as his wife, George Villiers, sorry, the Duke of Buckingham as his wife. And there's a as he gets older, there seems to be a refining of that language. If you go back to some of the earlier letters I include in the book, because they are more rare, some of the early ones when he's in sort of in his early 20s, they're that rush of infatuation that you have where you're not really thinking. And when he writes to the Earl of Huntley, since you left me, I cannot stop thinking about you for more than 1 hour, except when I'm sleeping, and scarcely then. There's not a lot of playing it cool with James early on, but he refines that language as he gets older, and by the end of it, with the Duke of Buckingham, it is very clearly marital language that he uses. And at one point, he says, again, this was assumed it would all be private,
Mm.
but he says, I would rather follow you to the corners of the earth and lose everything than stay here and live like a widow without you. So you see that kind of the sentiment remains equally strong,
Mm,
the same lack of sort of self-editing, but in terms of how he expresses it, it becomes much more clearly romantic and marital.
mm. Now, of course, he does marry, very successful in terms of how
Yeah,
many children they have as well. He marries Anne of Denmark in 1589, and you cover the story, which is incredible, of her her failure to get over here from Denmark or over to Scotland, should I say, because of storms, and he sort of loses patience or something, I don't know, and decides to go and get her himself. It's incredibly romantic, actually.
yeah. Well, yes. Or he does make an interesting comment where he says that at this point, just before Anna of Denmark arrives in Scotland, there's been a lot of pressure on him to marry and a lot of gossip about why he isn't pursuing marriage. And he does say it was generally found fault with me by all men that I was so slow to marry. And he's quite chippy and angry in this
Mm,
letter about it. And it comes suspiciously close to this over performance of love.
right.
We know that he's done it before. We know that when he was told to write to princesses, one of them, the Princess of Navarre, Catherine, thought his letters were ridiculous. She said they were too much in their devotion. So sometimes he does seem to overcompensate.
Mm,
I'm going to slightly contradict myself here because I try to let the reader make up their own mind. I think the timing would suggest that he is so stung by public speculation about his private life, and in particular a romance that he ends in order to marry Anna, that he's a bit much. He's sort of, I think it's the equivalent of someone who's going to be not going to be a very good boyfriend is often the one that writes you songs. And Now, the other thing, maybe there was a rush of genuine romantic hope. I will say for him, I do think he went into the marriage with every intention of trying to make it work, and that the last romance with a man, um, sort of a long term, a friend of his, Alexander Lindsay, that that would be the end of it.
mm.
And the evidence I find is that he really tried. I do think to give him credit there, he tried.
Because that's what I wanted to ask you was, um, do you think he intended to remain faithful to Anna? I was going to say women only, but this is an example of a female affair he has as well,
Yeah.
fairly early on. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that was so I will say that there's an alternative theory to mine, which is that even this alleged affair with a lady of the court called Anne Murray was a performance, and it did come at a time when his relationship with Queen Anna was strained. They were in a sort of polite mutual dislike of each other. They'd fallen out over the upbringing of their eldest son.
Mm,
And the evidence that we have is that this lady of the court who served in Anna's household is referred to as the king's mistress in two letters over the summer of 1595. And there's some pretty, I think, biological erotic poetry that James has talking about his earthly parts being inflamed when Anne Murray is around. It's a credible theory, I think, that maybe he was sort of flaunting Anne Murray, which is why the ambassador noticed, because he just wanted to annoy his wife.
all right.
But my instinct is that actually there probably was a fling with Anne Murray, and I'm going on Anna of Denmark's reaction, which, true to form, she's probably one of my favorite people I've written about, but
Mm.
it's not subtle. I mean, she absolutely loathes her, and they had been friendly, and then that stopped. And she ensures that she can't come back to court. She tries to torpedo her private life. I think Anna's reaction to Anne Murray says a lot that there probably was something there. There are no other women that we know of, but one of the things you have to do with writing a book like this is you sort of have to let go of the more modern idea that gay people are only gay, and that no man who has sex with men is ever sort of incapable of desire or arousal or sexual performance of the woman. So very clearly, James did have a relatively active sex life with his wife, and I think a short fling in 1595 that if his poetry is to be believed, he very much enjoyed. Although I suppose you could make the point that he's hardly going to write a poem that says like it was all right. Could have taken it or left it. No, I think he did enjoy it. So yeah, and what was interesting is it stops when she gets married.
Right.
So it's I think Anne Murray was is a contender.
I mean, I will say this for him: whichever relationship he's in, he's all in. Like
Oh,
he
he's all in.
doesn't faff, does he?
No.
He's devoted in the moment.
Yes, which is probably in fairness to people who doubt the Anne Murray scenario. I do think it was pretty much just sexual because that's the one relationship where he doesn't seem to be all in. I mean, even with Anna, at one
Mm,
point he is all in, or at least he is trying very very hard. And I do think that whilst it was not a passionate romance at all between the two of them, that what I uncovered was a real friendship and some really funny letters between them where they're making fun of people of the court. But with any of the men, those six men that I cover, yes, when he's in, he is completely
mm,
devoted to them, and for me, probably the most moving letter I think is the one it's an extraordinary thing to have survived, and thank goodness it did. But it's a letter between him and a later favorite, the one before the Duke of Buckingham, where the relationship is cracking apart, and James admits in this letter that he knows he's not expressing his feelings well enough in words. So he takes to paper and reading it the whole way through. There are some specific court matters and all the rest of it, but actually it could be the cry that anyone has made when they're watching a relationship crumble apart in front of them and they can't put it back together. You can feel the fear of loneliness, pushing through, and he's trying. He says like, I'll change some things, you change some things. Please don't let me think that you ever held on to me out of anything but love. I mean, it's really it's painful stuff, and I think for me anyway, one of the great joys of being a biographer or a historian is that sometimes this it's like a hand reaches out
mm,
and just reminds you from across the gap of the decades, reminds you of your shared humanity. And that letter is a very, I think, powerful example of that.
mm. Because I wanted to ask if, were his relationships true love sort of from both parties' perspective, or were there any that you think were an act of manipulation, perhaps on the other party's um,
Well,
side?
to quote his descendant and current successor, Charles III, whatever love means, whatever love is. Um, yeah, there's some. I think the love is very obvious. I think to my mind, there are two that really stand out as very obviously love. I think one of the early ones, yes, very much so. And it was a member of the Scottish nobility and who never asked for anything from him and actually at times helped him and sacrificed parts of his own happiness and his own fortune to help James. So with that one, I think it really was love. There's another one, the later one I was talking about with Robert Carr, whom I'm
Mm,
sure many people of your viewers and listeners will be familiar with. I think Robert Carr was at the start love. I do think that the great difficulty is George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, and the reason why is when you read the letters between them, they're at times playful and yes, loving, but then I'm sure if George was acting it, he was a very convincing actor. And one of the things that, for instance, marks him out to Somerset before him is that with Somerset, Robert Carr, there is pretty good evidence that's been looked at by a previous historian, Anne Somerset, who I think many people probably recognize from her brilliant biography of Elizabeth I, that would suggest that Robert Carr had a male romantic partner beforehand, which would lend credence to him sincerely feeling that love and desire with
Mm.
James. With Buckingham, there's no, that I came across, there were no other men that he was linked to, but which, trying to figure out when someone truly is in love is tricky. So what I do is I quote from the letters, I describe what he did, and sort of let the reader make their own mind up. Because in many ways, what I'm trying to do with this is to write hopefully a good biography, and also to let the reader make their mind up about a couple in the way that we might. I mean, I'm sure you know a couple where you thought, oh, they're so in love, but someone else you know who also knows them thinks, oh, they're not really that happy. So I think different people see different dynamics. But in terms of, um, I suppose, in terms of James's love for him, no question. In terms of Buckingham's for James, I suppose if I was defending him, what I would say is it is very difficult in that era to love a man and a king, and for one not to influence the other. And George certainly makes himself a very, very wealthy man as a result of it. So I don't, I think to me, there was probably affection there, but there was
Mm.
also a plan.
Mm.
So it's never quite binary in that sense.
Which leads me on to asking what the political ramifications were for a king to be in relationships, such well, obviously close relationships with other men.
It depends at what point in his life you're talking about. So there's relatively little pushback about Patrick Gray, partly because it's not as obvious as some of the other ones will be, and Patrick doesn't become that important. There's very little pushback at all, in fact, almost none, about Alexander Lindsay, and I think that's probably a testament to his personality. But I also think, and likewise with Philip Herbert, there's none. There's some nasty comments from the Howards, which is probably a sentence you could say of pretty much any point of English history between like 1500 and 1700, but they insist on referring to him quite sneeringly as the Welsh Earl. But that's the height of it. And in the same way they hate Robert Carr for being Scottish. They're not a loving family.
They're not the nicest of people, the
They're,
Howards, are they?
they're not the inclusive welcome wagon of the English court.
Almost like they had something to hide. Yeah.
um, you just, I mean, I was sitting there, I was like, how am I still writing a book? Whereas all of a sudden, this family, the Howards, pop up and are trying to um, advance themselves over the corpses
Mm.
of the reputations of their contemporaries. It's, nothing changes except what stays the same. Anyway, yeah, I think if they're in the background, it's fine. The later two, and in particular Buckingham, has massive, massive political consequences. There is a scandal about Somerset. Buckingham becomes a lightning rod around the question of England getting involved in the 30 Years' War, and he is blamed for James's decision not to get involved, which is hugely unpopular. But by this point, also James is not as healthy as he had been, and he is more reliant on them. So the political consequences, and I go into this in the book, their Parliament comes that close to outright saying it. I mean, the language that they use to insult James and George is, I was surprised at how open the kind of they try to liken the royal household to a cistern so that they can make a joke about how the cistern of the monarchy is being drained by private cocks. So they use all of this language to make, and the speaker at that point does interject and knows exactly what they're trying to say and tries to pull them back. So it does factor hugely into criticism of him. Where it gains legs, if you like, after his death is anti-royalist writers in the reign of his son, who are trying to use James's sexuality to present him as a moral cesspool and cesspit, and that there is no justification for the royal family to be in the position they're in, and his sexuality is part of that. And that's one of the reasons why I sometimes try to defend later authors. I'm thinking 19th and really up until say about the 1970s, 1980s, uh, who argued that James was heterosexual or asexual. And I think some people have seen that as sort of a conspiracy or that it comes from quite malign motivations. It did require them dismissing mountains of evidence. But I don't think it came from a malign place. I actually think it came from a really positive place. If in a weird way. It came from a, sorry, the place it came from was sad, but the genuine motivation they had, I think, was positive. You have to understand in the Victorian period, through the Pink Scare in the 1950s up until about the 1990s, to call someone homosexual was to insult them. There was no public discourse in which that could be a positive attribute. And so when people, serious historians, were trying to rehabilitate James as a serious king, they had to push through that anti-royalism that had erupted in the middle of the 17th century and the slurs of his own lifetime to say that that wasn't true. He hadn't been sleeping with these men. And I think it's unfortunate that they lived in a world where that was a necessary thing to do
Mm,
in terms of defending someone, but the denials of his sexuality were not something that came from a place of um, a negative or hateful place. They came from people who were what they thought doing the best they could. And I think that
mm,
probably some of them believed it genuinely.
yeah, they have an audience of its time as well as their
Of
being a
course.
writer of their time. So was there more um issue, if you like, with James's sexuality after his life
Yes.
than during?
Yes. I will say the political scandals surrounding something called the Overbury scandal, which I go into in the later part of the book, and the Parliament of 1621. It does factor into it, and it does become and there's a big scandal in Scotland that they just about managed to keep the lid on in 1600 called the Gowrie House scandal, the Gowrie House conspiracy. But those are three major flashpoints, and actually, it's pretty remarkable that there weren't more, given when he was alive and where he was ruling. It becomes a huge thing in the debates of his son's reign, partly because Charles I's private life is beyond reproach.
Mm,
Whatever you think of his politics, and obviously many people think they were appalling, but when you look at Charles I as a husband to Henrietta Maria, and as a father and as a brother, he's a sort of exemplary model of a marriage and a husband, father, etc. So in a world that is very interested in those kind of morals, they can't critics of the monarchy can't really go after Charles on that ground. So they can, however, go after his father. And a man who is seen even at that point as being one of the chief architects of the political ideology known as the divine right of kings. So if you're trying to attack it and you present James as a sort of slobbering, filthy pervert who's constantly fiddling with his codpiece and leering over attractive young men, it's very easy to decimate the monarchy in that way. And it'll be done again with Marie Antoinette on the eve of the French Revolution. They go after, I mean, they make things up about her, but the way, or Catherine the Great and sort of the stories about her practicing bestiality. There's a tried and tested method to discredit royals. You make up stories that they're having affairs or that they are an atypical kind of sexuality. You go for the private life in order to decimate the public
mm,
credibility, and that's what they
mm.
do with James in the 1640s and 1650s.
Fascinating. Yeah, we see it with Anne Boleyn, the
Yeah.
charge of sex with her brother. It has to be so it has to come across that if you try and defend them, that you're defending the act, and
Yeah.
that's why they go so far.
Which is what they do in witchcraft trials as well. I always try to
Mm,
say you have to do not start with an assumption that witchcraft doesn't exist. In the same way that we know that incest does exist, and we know that abuse exists, and we know that all those kind of things do exist, they know that witchcraft exists, or they believe that witchcraft exists. So in the witchcraft trials, you've many people doing exactly what you just said, where they think, oh, but what if they did it? And I'm defending satanic activity. So
mm,
it's, again, a lot of these things seem obscure and frozen in amber and preserved as a relic of their time, but there's also a huge eternal echo of what we are as humans and what we're capable of, sometimes in a really negative way.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we finish the main interview, move on to the questions I've got from
Yeah.
my patrons. I've got one final question. It's a bit of a diversion from what we've been talking about, but it's one that's come up before, and you've kindly answered it to me in private, but I thought I would ask it you here, and
Yeah.
that's about the incredible number of men which James knighted on his protracted journey down from Scotland into London, and um, and the query was around like the number.
Mm.
By the time you've got that many people having it, like what's the point? What's the purpose, either for James or for especially really for the men who are being knighted?
Well, conservatives at court completely share your conclusion, which is what's the point of the title? They refer to it as the prostituted title because he's knighted so many people, whereas Elizabeth I, his predecessor in England, had been much more reticent about who she knighted because she, I think, understood the title had to mean something. And this goes
Mm.
back to your one of your first questions about etiquette and the glamour of titles. And James, when it comes to knights, he doesn't really think it matters. He does, I will say, he does think more of aristocratic titles. So Baron, Viscount, Earl, Marquis, and Duke. Knights, less so. So one of the things I will say in his defense is that a knighthood is not hereditary. Unless it's a baronetcy, but that's sort of going into the weeds here. But he's not creating a whole new class of people. They're already members of the elite, and also it's for instance, when he stays at a home in Yorkshire on his journey south from Scotland to England in 1603 for the first time, he knights the son of the family because it's an easy way to thank the family for their hospitality without
Mhm.
having to give them anything of material worth. So it saves it a bit. He also, as I mentioned, very, very loyal friend. And he had been in financial difficulties for some time before becoming King of England for a variety of reasons. And he had felt he'd not always been able to generously reward some of his lifelong friends. And so he's completely fine with with his Scottish entourage taking outrageous bribes from English families who want knighthoods for their sons because he thinks, well, do you know what? It costs me nothing, and it means that I can reward them too for their years of loyalty. But to your point about what's the point for them, I love that because it's one of the things I think we've spoken about sort of off camera before, and I always try to remind myself and people I'm talking to, is that never assume that they can get information the way we can. I mean, you can't. Some of these people don't know what's happening in the next village, let alone what is the quota of knighthoods that have been miscreated in 1603. So yes, if you are a conservative leaning aristocratic court, you can see how many knights have been made and you think, good grief, this is mud in the water of high society. However, if you are someone living in Yorkshire or Lancashire, anywhere that James has gone through, you are not likely to know that he was creating just as many knights in the next county. So actually, for the knights who get it, it's as much of a prestige as it was under Elizabeth in the localities. It's just in London that the title starts to lose its luster.
Right. Fascinating. I suppose as well, whoever they meet generally wouldn't know that it's,
No, you were
they were
you were
10 a
part of,
penny.
yeah, or you were one of the 3,000 or whatever. You were one of the metric ton of knights that came out of 1603. No one's going to remember that.
No.
It's us and aristocrats who know it, but I don't think the knights and their friends did.
Right. Well, fabulous. Well, there's so many more topics we could have picked up on from your book. I mean, we've got witchcraft and Anna herself. I called her
Oh,
Anna, but I mean, she just comes across
love
as
her.
somebody I wish I could have met. She's
I
incredible.
love her. And even when she's being so badly behaved, I mean, objectively, I know what she's doing is it's not even morally questionable. I know what's wrong. I can't bring myself to not to have not even a sneaking, a full-throated admiration for it. I mean, she never met a diamond that she didn't want to buy. She thought that budgets were a concept that applied to other people and not to her. She certainly tore apart a few careers for fun. she's just, but she's so interesting and substantial, a good friend, brilliant mother, and I think she'd have been so much fun,
Mm.
and what else can you say about someone who hates her husband's current boyfriend so much that she finds the next one and gives him some sort of very revealing masquerade costumes in order to seal the deal?
Yes, I
Just,
read that.
it's, I mean, from a biographer's perspective, and hopefully a reader's, a gift.
So much. James was so impressed that he asked them to do the performance again a few
Again,
days later. I
no, I
remember
didn't.
that.
With George Villers, I hadn't even thought. As she's sort of, shimmering from head to toe and whatever emerald she's taken a shine to that day. Yeah, she's fabulous.
She is fabulous. So I thoroughly just get the book, everyone, because there's so many brilliant veins of topic throughout that it's going to be well worth your time. And of course, Gareth has done the Audible.
I have for the first time. I've done it. I had such a brilliant time, and it was in the studio in London. It's strange saying this because I said this to you off camera. Yeah, I did it for a week, 4.5 days really, in a studio in London just after Christmas, and luckily avoided sore throats over the Christmas holiday, so I got
Mm,
able to do it. I loved it. I really enjoyed doing the audiobook.
I think people are going to really enjoy you narrating your own book this
I
time.
hope that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. I mean, it was interesting coming from Northern Ireland. We've certain inflections and um, pronunciations of things that are fairly similar to certain Scottish accents. So it was quite. I felt
Mm,
myself get more into that rhythm as I was reading the sections in Scotland. So and also they obviously they do discuss it in one of the chapters, his performance as King of Ireland. So it was quite nice getting to do that
mm.
as well.
Yeah. Well, obviously I'm going to read it and I'm going to download the Audible definitely.
Thank you.
Um, so there's a couple, if you don't mind, of bonus questions
Oh,
I'm
yeah, of
putting to
course.
all guests now. Um, and then we'll come on to the Patreon section. But these are my questions. So the first one, this might be a bit difficult for you actually. It's normally which period of history outside of that for which you are known are you most interested in? So what do you basically which part of history do you read for fun?
Yeah, which I read and not write. Yeah, that's a good.
Mm,
Yeah. The one I geek out on, two I geek out on is Ancient Egypt, which is a pretty
mm,
which is fascinating, and Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire. Love it. Just there was a trilogy by John Julius Norwich about the Byzantine Empire, and I still think it's. I mean, they're out of print, but they're three, I think, of the most extraordinary history books I've ever read.
really? Well, you put fascinating posts about Egypt and
Yeah, I love
Byzantine
it.
yeah on your Instagram.
But I couldn't write it. I mean, I do some podcast posts, but I think I'm so in awe of people like, Colleen Darnell, who's doing this a lot of brilliant Egyptology stuff on social media. I'm really in awe of that. And I think when you love a period of history, you're grateful to the
Mm,
people who've dedicated time to become experts in it so that you can access it. So yeah,
yes,
ancient Egypt and the Byzantine Empire are my two.
wonderful. And what do you think we can learn from history?
Uh Gosh, that's such a huge thing.
Mm,
I suppose on the one hand, as I mentioned, the eternal lessons of humanity are there, but also hopefully the humility. I think it teaches us humility in certain ways. The first is hopefully it teaches us the humility of catastrophe. And what I mean by that is sometimes when I'm fretting about the way the world is going, I remind myself that actually this is not the 6th century when the world actually looked like it was on fire, and this isn't, the Black Death.
mm,
And I think it can teach us to be grateful,
mm,
but it can also teach us to be watchful and not to take the things we are grateful for granted. Because
mm.
because history will also teach you that all empires fall and all things change, and when the world turns, it's not pretty often, and it's usually it's history will both inspire and horrify you, and hopefully it will inform and warn you at the same time. I suppose the last thing I would say that I have just it's this is very imprecise because I'm still thinking through it. All those things I've just said are the eternal nature of humanity, and I think that does come through history. The one thing I think we still need to be better at, including myself, is not attempting to make it everything like us. And there's a book I'm reading at the minute called They Flew by Carlos Ara, History of the Impossible. And he's looking at four miracles in the 16th century. And basically, from what I can tell so far, his core argument is stop trying to understand it like we would understand it. The only way to engage with this is to accept that it's real. Even if you
Mm.
don't believe that St. Giuseppe of Cupertino levitated or St. Maria Figueira was in two places at one time, the point to understand how they react to it, accept the miracle as real in the first place. And I've sort of been thinking that that's a really interesting and helpful way to do it because you don't get bogged down in trying to explain what it was. You get to explain what people believed and how they reacted. So
Mm.
accept the eternal nature of humanity through history, but also accept the unique cultural strangeness that we all have. And in 200, 300, maybe 20 years, people will be looking back on us and being like, and respecting our cultural strangeness.
Yeah. I always think when we say how silly people were about I don't, but the
Yeah.
temptation can be, oh, they stuck lead on their face or
Yeah,
they
we
drank
stick fake
dirty
tan on ours,
water.
babe. Like we're not like it's people say that about people will be showing photographs of us with fake tan on, being like, or in tan beds, and they're like they went into
Mm,
metal beds with UV rays. I know
mm.
nothing about science, but something dangerous, and they crisped themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like
Oh, there'll be things we're doing that we haven't even thought about,
yeah,
that in
yeah,
the
yeah,
future they'll be like, in 2025 they believed that X, Y, and
yeah,
Z was
yeah.
fine. I don't know, whatever it'll be.
They thought AI
Um,
was going to be a good thing. Yeah, there'll be lots of stuff.
Yeah, there's all sorts probably
Yeah.
coming down the pipeline. Okay, so before we do finish up and move on to the questions from my patrons, um, tell people please where they can find you, your work, and remind us please about your new book's release dates.
Yes, so you can find me on Instagram where I think I'm probably most active, which is underscore Gareth Russell. My podcast is Single Malt History, and the book Queen James: The Life and Loves of Britain's First King is out in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand in audio on the 27th of February. It's also out in hardback in Britain and Ireland on that date. Available for pre-order or order, depending on when you're watching this, and it will be out as The Six Loves of James the First in both audio and hardback in the USA and Canada, and it's also available for pre-order there too.
And that's 2nd of December, I
That's the
believe.
2nd of December, so it looks like there will be some winter frolicking and hopefully book signings in New York, and we'll see what this. Yeah, we'll get that scheduled
Ooh,
probably September maybe.
oh, that'll be exciting. That'll be great. Well, thank you so much, Gareth.
Oh, thank you.
Before you go, actually, I have another minute for you of Gareth talking about King James I. That is it's a little preview actually of the extended ad-free version, which is in patreon.com/British history. And it's the part where my patrons have asked Gareth some brilliant questions and he has very kindly answered them all. If you go over and join Patreon, then you will be able to not only watch that and many other extended interviews with historians, but you will be able to put your questions to future guests as well. So I do hope you join us over there. There's many more benefits as well, including book club and all sorts of stuff. But if you go and have a look, there's a list of what you get for your low monthly fee, and we would really love to see you over there. All right, but for now, anyway, here's another minute of Gareth.
Elizabeth I, I think that there is evidence that she knew or that she had suspicions. And in fact, I don't think I show this in the book, I think her government was trying to recruit some of his lovers in Scotland as their spies. Father James kind of slots them into roles almost
Mm.
father, uncle. It's quite obvious where he puts them, and these are roles that sadly have been missing from his life. The Bible is the word of God, and James takes it really seriously. But I was very struck by how involved he was, partly because one of his great passions was languages and the other was theology. So for him, this was a goldmine.
Now, the title change for the US, was Queen James deemed too
No,
controversial? for the answer to that question and so much more, please go over to patreon.com/British History.